The contracts question from July of 2002 is a particularly difficult fact pattern. This is a hypothetical that challenges your ability to spot issues and organize efficiently. To my way of thinking, this is one of the more difficult contracts questions ever to appear on the California bar exam. At least, that's the impression I get from talking to people who actually had to write an answer to this question under test-taking conditions. But this is a fact pattern that our contracts approach is tailor-made for. Have a look at the call of the question. 1. What defenses should TravelCo assert on the merits of Polly's breach of contract claim? And what is the likely outcome? Discuss. Well, you don't need to read the fact pattern to know that the defendant in a contracts action can put in defenses in several different places of the analysis. Defenses to formation, defenses to breach, and then defenses to remedies. Those really are all of the places where a defendant in a contracts case can make arguments. So we can organize our basic outline to call of the question number 1 before we even read the fact pattern. Next, question 2. Which items of damages, if any, is Polly likely to recover? Discuss. Well, we will just isolate each damage that she might want and then talk about it separately. So it's a contracts question, but we are focusing on defenses. I think that makes it a little bit more difficult, especially for people who don't have a well-organized way of thinking about contracts defenses. And remember, if you know about defenses to formation, defenses to breach, and defenses to remedies, you've got the magic key. You're way ahead of most of the people that are taking the examination, and that's how to answer it. So let's go to the top of the question. Here we've got a pretty short fact pattern, and this one's true to form. This is a more difficult question because we've got to interpret every detail in it. So look at paragraph 1. Here we meet our defendant, TravelCo. They run an ad in which they are talking about a contest. You see the word promise in the first line. They are promising to fly the contest winner to Scotland. Okay, what do you think about this ad? Is this an offer? I don't think it has any contractual impact at all. I think this is merely an offer to make a donative gift. And one thing you know about gifts, they're freely revocable until reliance or some other specific fact makes them irrevocable. Well, we're going to see some facts that the plaintiff is going to claim look like reliance. Have a look at paragraph 2. Polly reads this ad, and she decides that she wants to win it. So, she changes her unlisted phone number to a listed phone number, so that TravelCo might have the chance to award her the prize. We know that we're in the twilight zone of law examination land when we get a fact like that. But let's focus on it. Does that constitute foreseeable detrimental reliance that might bind TravelCo to the promise made in the ad? Again, I say obviously not. But if you spend much time looking at my materials, you might detect a certain pro-defense bias, which even I find impossible not to notice once in a while. So, once again, I'm not insisting that you agree with me, but take a look at this fact pattern, and I think probably you're more likely than not to agree with me that Polly's act of getting a listed phone number is not sufficiently foreseeable to entitle her to enforce an otherwise unenforceable donative gift. We move on in paragraph 2, and sure enough, TravelCo picks Polly's number and notifies her. So now she's received notification of her win of the contest. Does that constitute a binding contract? I say no, it's a mere donative promise. But what does Polly do? To celebrate her victory, she goes and buys a fancy bottle of champagne and she drinks it. Okay, is that an act of foreseeable detrimental reliance that might bind TravelCo to keep their promise? Again, I say no. And plus, it seems to me that by drinking the champagne, Polly has enjoyed the benefit of the champagne. So, moving on. In paragraph 3, we see Polly buying a bunch of luggage and a bunch of fancy golfing clothes for her trip. Do either of these acts constitute foreseeable detrimental reliance that might serve to bind TravelCo to its donative promise? Once again, I say no. Now, I can grant that a reasonable person might look at all of these facts and, taken as a whole, judge Travelco to be bound. Okay, well, I'm not saying that you're definitely wrong, but I don't agree with that result. I do admit that many of these questions, including this one, are framed in such a way that one could write a reasonable, lawyer-like, passing response to the question, and that's pretty good on the bar examination. So, in paragraph 3, we also see Travelco's alleged breach. Travelco calls her up and says, sorry, we don't have the money to pay for this trip, so we're canceling it. Now, if you take my point of view that this is merely a donative promise and that none of Polly's acts constitute foreseeable reliance, then Travelco's got the right to freely revoke this gift, and Polly has no remedies. And, in fact, as you'll see, that's my answer to the question. But once again, I grant that someone could look at these facts and analyze them carefully to reach the opposite conclusion. In paragraph 4, Polly sues for breach of contract. She wants damages for the following 5 items, and they're listed for us. She wants to be paid for listing her phone number, for the champagne, for the luggage and clothing, for losing her job. She quits her job in order to take this trip, and then the value of the trip itself. Obviously, I think these claims are nonsense, and I find for the defendant throughout. But our job is not to just say who wins. Our job is to create a well-organized, thorough, thoughtful response. So we get the call of the question again. What defenses can Travelco assert? What's the likelihood of success? And then, what damages, if any, does the plaintiff get? Well, flip the page and have a look with me at the outline of issues that I've presented. And you'll see, once again, that what I'm doing is simple. But if you don't know how to do it, you're much more likely to flounder around and not come up with a really solid response. So, have a look with me at the outline of issues. When we get to defenses to formation, you'll see internally that I'm using the facts as the organizing principle. Once I spot an issue, and that issue doesn't readily break up into elements, but that issue's got a number of specific facts connected to it, I just use those facts as an organizing principle, and I explain what happened, and then I explain what all of it means legally. And that's what I do with regard to defenses to formation. Next, I turn to defenses to breach. This is a simple argument. Travelco's defense to breach is they weren't subject to a binding contract. They had merely made a donative promise, and a donative gift is freely revocable. After that, I allude to a defense to damages. But since damages are the subject of the second part of our answer to this question, I discuss them below. Finally, I conclude in favor of the defendant. I don't think Polly has a valid breach of contract action. But we're not done there. Even if we agree that the defendant wins, we've got to talk about damages, and so I lead off, for once, with the rule. I talk about what damages are available under breach of contract actions. Then I go into Polly's contract damages claims. And here again, since we don't really have elements of law to organize our answer around, and since we do have 5 specific damages claims that this plaintiff is making, I just use each claim as an organizing principle, and then I write whatever I have to say about each one of them. Ultimately, I conclude that there's no binding contract. Travelco faces no liability, and the plaintiff loses altogether. Okay, fine. Now let's briefly take a look at the example answer that I've presented for this question, and we'll see just how important it is to tell the story by finding a home for all of the facts. Remember, this is a short fact pattern. We need to go into great depth on every issue, and we need to talk about all of the different facts. So we lead off with our first heading, an answer to the question, what are Travelco's defenses to Polly's breach of contracts claim? And rather than just talking about offer acceptance and consideration, I go into the defenses. So I talk about defenses to formation, and I go into it in a fair amount of depth. Then I talk about the defense to breach. Here again, you'll see that I find a home for every fact in this pattern, really without any exception. And more importantly, I interpret those facts in the legal context that they arise. Next, at the top of page 2, I allude to the upcoming discussion of defenses to damages, which is properly a province of our answer to the second call of the question. So, finally, I conclude the breach of contract section simply and directly. I conclude that no contract existed between these parties, and that Pauley's breach of contract action fails on the merits. Okay, fair enough. Next, we turn to Travelco's defenses to damages. And as I alluded to earlier in this discussion, for once I lead off with the rule. I explain what damages are available to a successful plaintiff in a breach of contracts action. Then I just go into the 5 specific damages claims that this plaintiff is seeking. Now, even if you disagree with me and think that this plaintiff ultimately has established a binding agreement, and even if you agree that ultimately she is going to be entitled to some damages, I think you'd probably agree that one of those damages would not be the cost of her changing her phone number. I think most people who agree that the plaintiff does have a valid case don't grant her this damage, because changing the phone number is sort of a part of the cost of doing business. That gets her eligible for the contract. It is not a part of foreseeable reliance. Next, the champagne. Now, some people actually award the value of the champagne, but many others, including many of those who are ultimately sympathetic to this plaintiff, don't award her damages for the champagne because she drank it. She enjoyed the champagne and, as I put it, fully enjoyed the benefits of the champagne. Moving on to the luggage and the clothing. Here, some people who think she's got a valid claim did let her win these damages. Now, from my point of view, even if you're going to find in favor of the plaintiff, you certainly don't necessarily award these damages. Why not tell her to return them, to mitigate her damages? And if there's a reshelving fee or a restocking fee, maybe let her win that in damages. But I don't think she should be entitled to recover for the luggage and the clothing, even if you do think that she's entitled to recover for the breach otherwise. Next, we turn to her lost job. And, once again, it just seems to me that even if we're going to be sympathetic to this plaintiff, the lost job isn't foreseeable to the defendant at the time that this so-called agreement was entered into. Still, we discuss it thoroughly and then leave it alone. Now, the cost of the trip. If you're going to find for the plaintiff, here's where you're going to require the defendant to make good its promise. And, ultimately requiring the defendant to pay for the trip is essentially the same thing as awarding specific performance. Now, I look at the facts and I honestly can't see a contract here. I just don't think the plaintiff has established a valid claim. But even I recognize that one could write a very successful answer aggregating the acts of reliance and having all of that add up to an enforceable agreement. If you reach that conclusion, then the damages that this plaintiff should be entitled to would be the cost of the trip. And you know what? If she gets that, then she gets to take her trip, and she gets to use her clothes, and she gets to enjoy the golf clothes and the luggage. So she will have all of the possible benefits associated with the burden. So looking back, probably she wouldn't mind having had the champagne. The bottom line here, I don't think the plaintiff has established a valid contracts claim, and therefore my conclusion is she takes nothing through her action and the defendant wins.